Hi, I am a 1-mana 1/2 that scries to and filters your mana. Kira.
Hi, I'm the better red beanstalk. Maya. Today we're doing a little bit of a deep dive into one particular card. So the last 2 weeks or so, we've seen a real shake-up in Standard. There has been a massive, massive change in sort of the decks that have been brought to the forefront. And it is thanks to the wonderful Tarkia Dragonstorm, the set that we've been excited about for a while, and we're finally starting to see make some real impacts in Standard. It's brought many improvements to many decks, and it's really filled out the sort of like tier 2 space in the Standard metagame at the moment. But one card in particular truly has cut through more than the rest.
Shing, shing, shoo, shoo, shing. That's me cutting through the meta currently.
It is a real contender for the best card in the Standard format right now. And today we'll chat about that card, what it does, how it fits into the decks it's played in, and how it will shape the metagame going forward, because Lord knows it will. We are talking about, of course, Cori-Steel Cutter.
And we just had a linguistic discussion about this card as well, because it's not, as one might immediately believe, Cori-Steel Cutter, as in
a steel cutter that belongs to the people
Cori.
of Cori.
It is a Cori-Steel Cutter.
A cutter made of the steel of the Cori. So it is not Cori-Steel Cutter, as is my immediate thought. The way
it's everyone's go-to. You just want to say Cori-Steel Cutter.
But it is, in fact, a Cori-Steel Cutter.
Regardless of how you say its name, this card is a force. This card is an absolute force in the format right now, and it has done some pretty incredible, awful, shocking, wonderful, fantastic, horrifying things to the format.
That sounds about right. Just so we can get our listeners up to speed.
We should probably tell them what the card is.
Let's work out. Yeah, let's decide what this card actually does.
Okay, Cori-Steel Cutter is a 2-mana, 1 and a red artifact equipment. It says equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has trample and haste. It has a flurry ability. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess. You may attach this equipment to it. It has equip, 1 and a red. But you are rarely worrying about the equip cost with this card. You are largely using the flurry ability.
I would argue it comes up more than you think because of the existence of Valiant abilities. But we'll talk about that more in a moment. Kira, how powerful actually is this card?
This card is the sign of a powerful card is the number of formats it pops up in and which formats it pops up in. This card is played in nearly every format that you're allowed to. And that speaks to its overall power and ubiquity and its utility. This card is played in Standard. It's played in Pioneer. It's played in Modern.
Oh, yeah.
It's played in Legacy. Mm-hmm. It's played in Highlander.
Yes.
And among these formats, Highlander, Legacy, and Modern are very high power formats. And its inclusion in decks of that format speak to its power. And even Standard is up and coming as a very powerful format, is coming up as a very serious format.
I remember talking to you about this card when I first saw it in the spoilers, because I think it was the wonderful Ben Tudman who brought it up, who was like, you should look at Cori-Steel Cutter. That card's good. This was after the episode, of course.
Yeah.
But I remember talking to you about this card, and I thought this card was kind of innocuous at first. I thought that it might be a very powerful fair card. And in a sense, I was right. This card is fundamentally fair. It's not breaking the game in any sort of, I hesitate to say degenerate, but in any sort of way that is particularly unique or particularly difficult to interact with. But where I got it wrong was a powerful fair card and not the most powerful fair card in Standard. This card is crazy. And it's crazy for a number of reasons. And I would argue that it is kind of difficult to evaluate how powerful a fair card is because it has to be so good across so many axes to be as powerful as this card is. But This card kind of ticks all the boxes. For starters, it is cheap. It is a 2-mana equipment, and it gives trample and haste and +1/+1 at its base level. That is already a limited playable card.
The trample and haste is just insane.
Yeah, it's already reasonably... That will see play in some fringe standard decks, right? Just if you remove the flurry text from Cori-Steel Cutter, it's just kind of totally fine. It's an artifact, so it also happens to dodge most board wipes. It's extremely resilient in that its effect allows it to be a threat regardless of consistent interaction. In this format, it's really easy to die to a Monastery Swiftspear, right? So the fact that it generates something that's largely equivalent to a Monastery Swiftspear means that every time this card triggers, it is getting you something quite close to a card, which means that it's also sort of card advantage. It triggers both on you and your opponent's turn. Now, this became really important for Ketramos, which is insane because it means the explosive potential after a board wipe is crazy. Your opponent board wipes, you cast 2 spells, create a 1/1 with prowess, untap, cast 2 spells. You now have a 3/3 with prowess and a 2/2 trample haste monk with prowess after your opponent spent 4 mana on a board wipe. It breaks parity on cards like cantrips. So a lot of not the issue with cantrips, but the downside for the very high upside of a 1-mana spell that draws a card is that the effect is relatively small. It is a close to 0 card effect. So, Scry 1, for instance, with Opt, or Mill 2 for Thought Scour. It breaks parity on cards like that. It gives you a really significant reward for playing cards that cycle, and it incentivizes playing highly, highly efficient cards, right? This is a card that you want to play a lot of 0 and 1 drops with.
The other thing that this card does is it rewards you for playing Magic.
Yeah.
It absolutely... What do you want to do in a game of Magic? Cast your spells, beat your opponent down to 0. And this is a card that really rewards that. This is a card that rewards spell slinging and casting multiple spells. There's... This card wouldn't work in a control shell because you're trying to play reactively and you're trying to, lure your opponent into a counterspell trap. You're trying to get them to play out their board and then board wipe them. You're really only doing one thing each turn. Cori-Steel Cutter is going to reward you for high octane Magic plays of, I'm going to make sure that I am casting 2 spells minimum every turn.
One of the heuristics that when you're teaching newer players you'll often use is the player who spends the most amount of mana in any given game is usually the player who wins the game. So, you have to have spent that mana, of course. You can't be sitting with a bunch of 6-drops in your hand. Oftentimes you'll lose that particular game. But the person who actually spent the most amount of mana on spells in a given game is usually the one that wins. And this very much incentivizes you to do that because it incentivizes you, A, to be proactive, and B, to play cards that replace themselves or cards that interact very efficiently. You want to spend all your mana every turn when you have a Cori-Steel Cutter in play. In my mind, a really interesting comparison to this card is Up the Beanstalk.
Okay. Talk me through that.
Sure. So, for starters, it's a cheap permanent that is difficult to interact with, that demands an answer, is resilient, and will win the game if it's left alone. However, Up the Beanstalk demands that you play cards that are inefficient, right? It rewards you, your reward for playing these inefficient cards or these expensive cards is more cards, which requires the game to be slow for you to capitalize on. In order to win through card advantage, you need to get to the point where you're converting those additional cards into spells that you've cast. When you think about the adage I just mentioned, the player who spends the most mana on spells typically wins the game. You need to have the time to cast those either slightly bigger spells in the Up the Beanstalk packages or the more spells that you have because of the cards you've drawn. Cori-Steel Cutter is at its best, though, in a fast game, where you're rewarded for playing efficient cards to generate even more pressure, which is what Cori-Steel Cutter does. And it's crazy. It's just unbelievably, immensely efficient. So where's it seen play?
Okay, the better question is, where isn't it seeing play?
Yeah, a little bit.
Where is this card not seeing any play? This card is being picked up by any deck that plays red and any deck that plays red aggressively. And why wouldn't you? It is, again, it's a hard to interact with permanent that generates threats consistently. Even after a board wipe and that little monk token dies, you still have a Cori-Steel Cutter sitting on your board. And as soon as you cast 2 spells, you get your little monk token back. Easy. Every red-based aggro deck loves this card. That'll be your classic mono-red aggro, mono-red prowess, green-red aggro, your Gruul aggro, your Gruul leyline, red-white burn, red-white mice. It goes in everything. This is the salt seasoning of the format. You can put salt on everything.
I would argue it's the stock.
Oh, the stock. Maybe, you know what? Maybe it's the coriander. Some people love it, some people hate it. Goes really well in a lot of things. Some people don't like the taste.
I was going to say it's the fundamental building blocks now off which every deck is built.
Yes. It is everywhere that a cheap red aggressive card would go. It has also created its own archetypes, and it has brought to life a color pairing that I have really been missing. It has really lifted up Izzet as a color pairing, the blue-red pairing. It is typically in a spell-based tempo deck with cards like Stormchaser's Talent and This Town Ain't Big Enough, Monastery Swiftspear, Opt and Sleight of Hand, Burst Lightning, Torch the Tower, and Shock, and Violent Urge, and Monstrous Rage. There are so many fringe red cards that I would start throwing into this deck just because of the ability of the card to be replaced in future, like Felonious Rage. Also great. Demonic Ruckus. Also good.
Some versions are playing Might of the Meek. Some versions are even playing just a couple of copies of Ren's Resolve.
And why not?
To refuel.
And why not? Literally, why not? This card is so good. It is worth building around. Similar in that way to Up the Beanstalk. Up the Beanstalk is a good enough card to build a whole deck around. And that's largely, we had the Shell of Domain prior to Up the Beanstalk. We had the Dominaria United, back when you had your Triomes and you had Domain, and that was your herd migration deck, Atraxa deck. And it got better with Up the Beanstalk. And you could completely rework and reorganize the Domain deck to work around Up the Beanstalk and Impending Overlords. Brilliant. And this is another card that is worth building around. The ability to just generate constant, big, punchy threats on every single turn.
Yeah, and I actually think this does a better job than Up the Beanstalk does. It is already playing into the existing game plan, right? You don't need to play cards that are worse than the cards you were already playing for Cori-Steel Cutter to be good. But Up the Beanstalk, you kind of do. With Up the Beanstalk and the evolution of the Domain decks, your ramp spells got worse, kind of, to accommodate Up the Beanstalk. You started playing Overlord of the Hauntwoods, which is a good card in the context of Xur, but that sort of came about by virtue of the fact that you kind of had to play the Overlords anyway. Mm-hmm. And you're playing Ride's End and, Static Snare sometimes, and the slightly more expensive removal spells that are worse in most contexts.
But are made better by Up the Beanstalk because of the replacement.
Exactly. Cori-Steel Cutter does not have that problem.
No.
It lets you play the best version of your deck plus an incredibly powerful, I hesitate to say card advantage engine, but tempo generation engine.
The effect that Cori-Steel Cutter has on the board is far more immediate, powerful, and scary than Up the Beanstalk in terms of providing immediate bodies that can attack straight away and often have some other upside, like the one that has the Steel Cutter has Trample.
It certainly does have some scary interaction, because particularly the Izzet deck with Spell Pierce and the new Blue Dragon Exhale and, all the other Quench variants that are currently in Standard, they play it as a really good way to get around the few bits of interaction that actually do interact with Cori-Steel Cutter. So, temporary lockdown stocks at the moment have gone through the roof because it is overwhelmingly the best way to deal with Cori-Steel Cutter because it answers to the Steel Cutter and the tokens it's created.
There's not very many ways to deal with Cori-Steel Cutter at the minute. There's temporary lockdown and Sheltered by Ghosts and that's kind of it. You have fringe ways to take care of it. There are other abilities on cards that say destroy target non-land permanent, but they often have some kind of downside. Requisition Raid is one that comes to mind immediately. And the reason it has a downside is that it's sorcery speed. But it's a spree card that 1 white, and it has 3 additional modes that are each 1 generic each. It's destroy target enchantment, destroy target artifact, and put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. And I can see something like Requisition Raid doing really well in red-white aggressive strategies, but those decks are probably also already playing Cori-Steel Cutter.
The other important part of that is you don't want to play that card in an aggro deck. Right? That card is, when you look at it in a vacuum, it doesn't actually meaningfully contribute to that strategy. And that's one of the really significant upsides of Cori-Steel Cutter, especially as compared to Up the Beanstalk. Because Up the Beanstalk still gets got by Get Lost. Right? There is actually a little bit of enchantment interaction in the format already that interacts favorably into Up the Beanstalk, but that doesn't really exist at the moment for artifacts, for Cori-Steel Cutter.
You've got a Braid, but again, it's in colors that are already going to play artifacts and are probably already playing it.
And in colors that already have better 2-mana removal spells that they want to be playing instead. Which is part of what makes this card really powerful. The other thing I want to note is that with aggro decks often come, and we're grossly generalizing here, in 2 flavors. Go big or go wide, right? You have your go wide strategies like your token strategies, things that put a lot of bodies on the board and kill you with numbers. These are decks like Jeskai Convoke and that flavor of aggro deck. And you have go big decks, so decks that are looking to pop up 1 or 2 particular creatures to be particular big and get blockers out of the way and deal damage in large chunks that way. So this is decks like Bogles, and I would argue this is deck like Bogles, Leyline, and I would argue some of the Mice decks. So the Mice decks that are more all in on your Heartfire Hero, Cacophony Scamp style decks. Cori-Steel Cutter solves this problem for you.
Well, because Cori-Steel Cutter does both of those things.
Exactly.
It goes big and it goes wide.
Exactly, which is part of what makes it really, really scary, because the answers that you play to deal with each of those things, you have to play both of, which inherently makes your deck worse. This card is incredibly powerful, it's format warping, it's incredibly strong, but is also fundamentally incredibly fair in what it's doing. And we haven't seen a card like that in a long time, and it's, as a blue-red enjoyer, I think it's incredibly cool. Kind of what I wanted to unpack now, because we've sort of talked about Cori-Steel Cutter, we've talked about why it's good, where it's good, what it's doing. One last point on how good Cori-Steel Cutter is in the red decks. Another one I know is actually, and circling back to that equip cost. It doesn't come up very often, but the equip cost kind of has 2 benefits, particularly in the mono-red Mice strategies. It triggers Valiant, and it makes it really, really hard to effectively chump block things like Heartfire Hero. So, as a resident Walls of Pixie enjoyer, one of the regular things you have to do as part of that strategy is throw a Pixie under a Heartfire Hero for no value. Chump blocking is a real and significant part of a strategy against a red deck when you are trying to outgrind them, because you need to survive. Cori-Steel Cutter does a very effective job of eliminating that as an option, because you can just equip the Cori-Steel Cutter to your Heartfire Hero, give it an extra counter, and then attack with Trample. You're still blocking with your Pixie deck, because otherwise you die, but it's much, much more difficult to recover from, because the damage so effectively breaks through small creatures, which is overwhelmingly what the format is made up of at the moment.
Well, then let's then transition into talking about how this card has impacted other decks in the format. We've talked a lot about the decks that it's gone into, the decks that it's improved. How is it pairing up against other decks in the meta now?
It's very interesting, because this deck has made life for Esper Pixie very hard. It interacts on an axis that is hard for Esper Pixie to deal with, and is also faster and bigger and wider than Esper Pixie. With the existence of Cori-Steel Cutter, it kind of just beats it on each of these axes. This is not to say Esper Pixie doesn't have game against this deck. There are games where, particularly if the red deck mulligans, you can interact with their hand and reduce the critical mass of cards that are required for Cori-Steel Cutter to work. But it does make life very, very difficult because regardless of how many times you recycle your Nowhere to Run, there's always going to be another monk around the corner. It has also made, as we've talked about, temporary lockdown much, much, much better. Temporary Lockdown, generally speaking, is the card against this deck, as it's cheap, it interacts with all of the permanents played in the turn, and it's difficult for the deck to deal with for more than a turn, as their primary piece of interaction against Temporary Lockdown, aside from Spell Pierce, is this town ain't big enough, which is fine, but only deals with the problem for a turn.
They will get the Temporary Lockdown back, and they will lock you down again.
Precisely. As a result, Orzhov Pixie stocks have gone up.
I was wondering how long. I know you already said it once, and I was wondering how long until Orzhov Pixie came back into the conversation.
Yeah, and look, we've seen this in some recent results.
Yes.
Orzhov Pixie is doing particularly well.
It is.
Funnily enough, Esper Pixie is also doing well because it's adjusted to play a few more ways to deal with problematic enchantments. A lot of the versions are playing Lauren to deal with Cori-Steel Cutter. There's also Azorius Control and the new Jeskai variant, which is also playing Temporary Lockdown in an effort to deal with these Cori-Steel Cutter decks. And we're also seeing Overlords shift away from their slightly more mid-range builds. Because, we used to see builds that featured Beza, some were playing, Serra Paragon and some number of stock-ups. Most of the versions are much closer to Matt Nass's version now, which was playing 3 Temporary Lockdown. I know the version I'm playing is playing 4. The presence of Lockdown has also made the other cheap aggressive decks worse. Playing a non-Cori-Steel Cutter aggro deck at the moment is much, much worse than it has ever been because you get beaten by Cori-Steel Cutter, and because of the adaptations that it's caused in the format, you get beaten by the non-Cori-Steel Cutter decks too, because the decks that you preyed on have kind of been pushed out of the format. As a result, you have the less explosive mono-red decks, the Esper Pixie decks, and the green-white token variants see a real downtick. So who are the big winners?
Red decks.
Red
deck wins.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's doing a lot of that right now.
Red wins in this exchange. This card, bar none, from anything that we've seen really in Tarkir, has had the same impact on the format as Cori-Steel Cutter. It is versatile, big, showy. It rewards you for playing the game, and it rewards you actively on the board. It is not necessarily a passive draw card for playing a spell. It's a get an aggressive threat for playing spells. And it is a card type that is currently difficult to interact with. Get Lost does not hit artifacts. And that is really difficult for those other aggro decks that are maybe playing a copy or two to hopefully, destroy the one blocker and push through damage on the very end. There are very few ways to deal with Cori-Steel Cutter well, and the ways that do exist are largely in decks that are already going to want to play it, so they're not playing, these Is It Prowess decks are not playing a Braid. These Is It Prowess decks are not playing Sheltered by Ghosts. Even certain variations of Boros decks, most of them are not playing Sheltered by Ghosts. And so you have a threat that must be answered that is hard to answer. And that kind of, no matter how you handle it, it's difficult to get out from underneath. Temporary Lockdown is one of the few really efficient ways because, as I've just said, those decks are not necessarily playing artifact removal or enchantment removal. And so throwing everything under a Temporary Lockdown does wonders for the opponent in that matchup. Cori-Steel Cutter is a force. It is an absolute force of the format, and it is going to remain that way for the foreseeable future.
I actually think it gets better in the foreseeable future because guess what's rotating soon?
Temporary Lockdown!
With the rotation of Dominaria United out of Standard in, I believe, August of this year.
I can't wait.
The major pieces of interaction for this deck go away, and the mice are staying. So's Cori-Steel Cutter. It's gonna be a red heavy Standard format, folks. And I, for one, welcome our monk overlords. The other thing I would say is keep an eye out for green-black graveyard. Its hardest matchups were the explosive red decks. So with Cori-Steel Cutter slowing down most of the aggro decks, I mean, as compared to like the leyline versions, it is possible with some adjustments that this deck becomes even more of a contender. It's already sort of unaffected by lockdown, so it's good against the, the Orzhov Pixie, the Overlords, the Azorius control. It is fast enough to contend with aggro on board as it goes really, really big and really, really wide quite quickly. But it does need more cheap removal in the face of Cori-Steel Cutter. But if it can adapt, it will attack the metagame from a really interesting angle that is going to be sort of unique in its way to punish the way slower decks are building to beat these Cori-Steel Cutter decks. So I think it will be a really interesting third level thinking deck, right? If the first level is play the Cori-Steel Cutter, the second level is play the thing that beats the Cori-Steel Cutter. I think green-black graveyard is going to be very good at beating the thing that beats the Cori-Steel Cutter. And with all that said, that's all that we have for you today. We look forward to seeing you again next week. New episodes release on Mondays at 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And until then, you can keep track of all our releases at Raise MTG on both Instagram and Blue Sky. You can find Kira on the same platforms at kirabobira.jpg on Instagram and kirabobira on Blue Sky, and myself at MayMTG on both platforms. A big thank you to the State Library of Victoria for the ongoing use of their space. And until next week, remember, Zhao had resolved to hold the bridge, defending the village behind him. But the villagers decided that Zhao would not stand alone.